Karen?
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to all of you. We're happy to have you join us for this second in a series of live chats ASNE is doing with industry experts. We certainly have two of those joining us today. A reminder, if you haven't already sent me a question, feel free to send me one during the broadcast. You can email that to me at karenpeterson223@gmail.com. Okay, let me go ahead and introduce the folks we have joining us today. First up is Kevin Goldberg. Kevin is a member of the law firm of Fletcher, Heald, and Hildreth, who focuses on First Amendment, Freedom of Information Act, and intellectual property issues, but more importantly, serves as ASNE's legal counsel. Kevin is active in several nonprofit organizations dedicated to free speech and open government, of the board of directors of the National Press Foundation, and immediate past president of the DC Open Government Coalition. Kevin has an undergrad degree from James Madison and a law degree from George Washington. Welcome, Kevin. Also joining us today is Lucy Dalglish. Lucy has been Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland since 2012. Prior to her adventure in academia, Lucy was executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. She's a former reporter and editor at the St. Paul Pioneer Press and a former trial lawyer at a large Minneapolis law firm. She served on the national board of the Society of Professional Journalists and president of the National Freedom of Information Coalition. Lucy has an undergrad journalism degree from the University of North Dakota and law degrees from Vanderbilt and Yale. Welcome to Lucy as well. Clearly, we have two very qualified people to help guide us through this conversation on fighting for access and fighting in many different ways, fighting for documents, fighting for access to meetings, access to sources. Before we dive in, Lucy and Kevin, I'm interested to hear you talk about a little bit in general, given your many years of experience and all that you've done. Is access really that much more difficult today? I know we're talking about it a lot. There's a high level of concern, but is it really that much worse now? I'll let you give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll dive in. I think that in general, access to official meetings and access to records is about what it was 5 to 10 years ago. It's not dramatically worse. It's not dramatically better unless you're dealing with an agency that upgraded its equipment and facilities and its law. There are certainly examples elsewhere. What's really different is the access and the attitude that the people have toward the press, led by, from the president on down. And I think that attitude is really permeating both the public's attitude toward the media and certainly government officials' attitude toward the media.
I'm here.
Your thoughts on that, Kevin?
I just got in. Sorry. The link just popped me in.
Alrighty. We're asking, Lucy just gave us some of her thoughts about access these days and whether it really is that much more difficult than it has been over past years.
I think so. I don't think it's just down to this administration in the last few months. I think it is something that's been building over time and even over multiple administrations. And I apologize if I am talking over some of the same topics that Lucy mentioned. We tend to think alike on this. I think, we see it's if there's one factor that I think is driving the access problems that we're seeing, it's the direct messaging that is now able to occur between the people who provide the content and the people covering the content. And it's not just government officials. We will talk about this a little later. I'll make reference to it. But we see the same thing among sports reporters, or among entertainment reporters. It's the rise of social media has made the need for those you're covering to actually need you, diminish their need for you. And that's a problem. That's what's causing the problem, I think.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'll let the two of you dive in. You've got a lot of great information to get through today, so take it away.
Thanks. So I guess what we're going to do is sort of go over what it is we are covering very quickly. You should see on your screen now for me sort of the 4 areas we're going to go over, which are access to information, access to meetings and events, what happens if your reporters are physically assaulted or arrested, and confidential, the use of confidential sources. And the reason that I think, we wanted to set this up this way is that these are sort of the order in which someone might generally try to follow a story. You're not going to do one and then move to the other. But quite often you're thinking to yourself, okay, I would get this through FOIA. And then, if that doesn't work out, maybe, if I don't get everything I need at the same time or afterward, I'm going to start following up by talking to somebody or asking the people in that same office. And then when that doesn't work, I got to work a little harder and go try to find these people if they're not picking up their phone or not answering my emails or they aren't answering my questions in a press conference. And then when that doesn't work, you're kind of thrown out to rely on confidential sources. So it all kind of fits. This is kind of the most desirable way to get valuable information to the last resort, I think, in the organization. Let's dive right in maybe and talk about FOIA issues generally that we've seen over the last few years. One of the things, and none of these are anything new. It clearly takes too long to get what you need at the federal level and quite often at the state levels. And that, if anything, is increasing. Why is it increasing? Among the trends we've been seeing, on behalf of ASNE, what I follow and working with others like the Sunshine in Government Initiative, we've done a lot of research on this and a lot of testifying before Congress, before agencies, before state legislatures. I can tell you in DC it's the same. There are simply more requests and less money and less staff answering those requests. It's too much demand, not enough supply, not enough good technology. What happens then is you're left in a very, as we see, haphazard process where a lot of things go wrong throughout the chronology of your FOIA requesting process, where either intentionally as a means of throwing up roadblocks in your face, or sort of unintentionally, the system is just overwhelmed. You end up having to fight a lot of little battles to eventually get what you need. And over time, that takes a toll. It takes a toll with your deadlines. It takes a toll with your pocketbook. It takes a toll just simply with your mindset of wanting to come back and do this. And then when somebody is putting up these roadblocks intentionally, obviously it becomes much more difficult. If you want a great overview, and I put this out just not only because I think it is a great recent overview, not only because I know I was one of the people he talked to, and I think Lucy might have been as well, but because he's a great guy, Dave Coulier at the University of Arizona just did a real great overview of all these problems that you could look at. I think if you just did that search, you'd find it. But what it comes down to is, you just have to, I think, be a lot smarter and a lot more efficient, because the process procedurally at both the federal and state level is less efficient right now. Now, looking to the state level, and then we can talk a little more. I'll invite Lucy after this to provide some of her thoughts on this. Then we'll talk about some things you can do in response, some tips and tricks. Would be, at the state, you really do have very much a Byzantine system, as I call it, with terrible responses. One of the bigger differences between state and federal, as I've learned and working a lot more within the District of Columbia, which I will note, as I always do, is not yet a state. You have much higher turnover with offices. You have fewer dedicated FOIA employees, and therefore you have less institutional knowledge about how things can and should and do work. And that creates another layer of problem for you that you're just going to have to expect and get ahead of. At the state level, there are entirely too much exemptions. We are blessed in the District of Columbia that our District of Columbia Freedom of Information Act largely tracks the federal, but I know there are states out there with, hundreds of exemptions that you have to deal with, and you may not even be aware of half of them. And when they're drafted so strictly and with such particularity, it becomes much harder to fight them in court than if you have sort of a broad-ranging personal privacy exemption, which on the one hand can be invoked against just about anything, but on the other hand gives you a lot of wiggle room to push back. The exemptions are increasing each year, and one of the reasons we really wanted to highlight the state separate from the federal is that at the state level, we are definitely seeing trends coming out over and over and over again as to what states are trying to do. Number one area is still anything doing with police records. Police records where personal privacy is involved, especially police records with the privacy of the officers involved, seems to be something that states are trying to protect, which I think all of us would sort of say, well, that's really something we now more than ever need access to. We saw 2 or 3 states last year try to pass exemptions that would protect the identity of an officer involved in a use of force incident or a shooting, and that would seem to be the exact. They put up reasons for this, but that would seem to be the exact opposite of what the public would want to know and have oversight of. Are these particular situations? In fact, anything involving personal privacy, and this has been going back years and years, tends to be touched with kid gloves by states right now. At the state level, those of you, especially in college towns, know that the FERPA law dealing with educational records remains a huge problem. Electronic access to court records is lagging behind where we should be. Not everybody has the ability to get to the courthouse, and the states are making it, if anything, more difficult for you to get access to records. It's only this past year, for instance, in DC, that we have had the ability to get access to actual opinions. Like, that's only ramping up now, and those are opinions. We're not talking about docket filings. We're not talking about briefs. We're not talking about the basic stuff that just allows you to oversee a case as to when it's going on. That's still really hard to do in a lot of states. And then finally, states are increasingly imposing fees upon people, including reporters, that want to access records as a means of keeping you from getting what you need. And that on the state level, more than a federal level, is becoming a very big problem. So I invite Lucy to weigh in on everything I've just said and give her thoughts on the state of access at both the state and federal levels right now. I think you're muted, Lucy. Yeah, I think Lucy's muted right now, so.
There, better?
Good, yeah.
There I am, sorry about that. One thing, there are some reasons why things have gotten dramatically worse at a time when technology should have made everything much better when it comes to just the systems that are coming out. For one thing, a lot more people know about Freedom of Information Act requests. Oftentimes you can now make them online. And when you had to do it in paper, I think you thought about it more, and you were, it took more time, and people spent more time carefully crafting a request. Now people will just fire off a request and ask for anything. And it's not just journalists that are doing this. I work at a university. I'm a state employee. I don't get sucked into these open record battles very often, but I have picked up a few, I think, good anecdotes. The president of our university came to speak to my journalism faculty about a year ago, and they asked him why it took so long to get just basic FOI requests. And they said that under Maryland law, and I think this is the case in some other states, you have to take the request in the order in which it came. And there was one young man who, in a 6-week period, fired off 145 different requests because he was mad about something, and they didn't have the ability to just say no. So my student journalists' requests were stacked behind. I mean, they graduated before they got access to that information. And a lot of time, people truly are doing a fishing expedition. One of the questions I get from the chief of staff here on campus periodically is, why don't they just pick up the phone and I'll tell them what to ask for? And when I was at the Reporters Committee, we frequently told people who were calling and asking for help, if at all possible, call somebody at the agency. You don't have to interview them, just say, can I talk to your records custodian? Or can you just tell me the name of the document where I would find this information? People, because they know they don't want to waste time going on a fishing expedition, oftentimes will help you. Finally, just a word about privacy. The privacy dilemma has gotten, if anything, worse. And particularly in the courts, I was at a workshop about 6 months ago with court administrators, and their attitude, which 10 years ago I thought was quite bad, if anything, has gotten worse. They truly believe that they are the last protection for the public. They know that there's a lot of sensitive information in court records, and they believe that it is their duty to keep people from seeing the private information that's in those records. And that attitude has gotten increasingly hostile. And then, because I have to deal with it whether I want to or not, FERPA. That is the federal law that makes education records off limits if they reveal the educational record of a student. This has gotten increasingly complicated these days now that the federal government is requiring universities to prosecute sexual assault and assault cases internally. And prosecute is the wrong word. Bring internal administrative proceedings. So there are often parallel criminal cases being handled by the city or the county. But when you are required to investigate each one of these cases, the only sanction a university has to do with someone's academic record. So all of a sudden, what you and I would consider to be criminal activity becomes an educational activity. And there's not a university out there that is not throwing these investigations of criminal and criminal-like behavior into the academic honor council system that they have. And the only thing they can do, they can't throw you in jail, they can't fine you. The only thing they can do is sanction you based on your academic record. It's created a monstrous mess. And I really, really don't see that getting any better unless we can work on the outside and convince more students to use the criminal process, because then it's much more transparent. But this is, you think it's a mess, you have no idea how much of a mess it is.
Okay, with that, we'll move on a little bit. Thankfully, on this next slide that I'm going to bring up, the responses, what you can do about them slide, we kind of have covered this ground. Lucy did a great job of anticipating what we'd be doing. You know, one of them is, you talked, Lucy, about the technology sort of creating a problem in that anybody can sort of fire off a request. I think there is some benefit to using technology in-house, if nothing else, for the fact that, A, it's going to coordinate across all people, and I think you need to have that point person. Lucy, you and I both know Sarah Cohen really well, and she was kind of like an overseer of a lot of requests everywhere she was in the data journalism area. And I know other people who have held her job at other publications, and she would like have spreadsheets upon spreadsheets, and I used to hear these great stories about it. I just want to see them once. And I know other people that do this as well. I was talking with someone who works for Climate Wire. Same thing. And I'm just fascinated as to how they take care of this. And you mentioned something about people graduating. Well, people graduating, you know, that kind of happens at publications as well, especially nowadays. There's a lot of movement.
Sure.
You got to be ahead of this, I think, as a newsroom and as a leader in coordinating what's going to happen if somebody leaves last minute and the story is still yours, right? They're gone. And now what, you know, nobody's sending the response to check in. And by the way, this is what happens. The response comes or a check-in comes from the agency, we call them still interested letters.
Right.
And what they'll say is, are you still interested in the answer to this request you filed 2 years ago? And if we don't hear back from you in 10 days, gone.
Gone.
So you got to have you have to have someone coordinating and overseeing all this. Technology is really useful. It is useful in getting these requests out, because one of the things we used to talk about that was a big problem in filing requests, especially at the federal level, was how many requests get lost in that whole swarm. And at least now you have a record of having submitted something, and it's easier to recreate, easier to find and redo. A lot of these will also automatically sort of catalog your requests. But more importantly, talking about finding things you already need or want or already know might be out there, Muckrock and FOIA both have, and FOIA Machine actually, they all have the ability now to search for already released information. That's what's happening with the federal FOIA Online, as we call it, the FOIA portal, which is hopefully still moving toward a release to all component that will allow you to search for information without having to file a request. And in that, in that same vein of, let's make sure that we, be smart about this and don't overwhelm the system. I think you're right. Treat FOIA requests like a story. And in doing that, you are sitting and thinking about it and what you really want, and you're doing a lot more research ahead of time. And now finally commit to the end. I want to move through this a little bit quickly now as we move into the other topics after this. Be open to negotiating. Find your state or federal ombudsman. They can be very helpful if you do run into hey, here's an exemption that is being applied, or better yet, at the federal level, if you don't get an answer at all, find your support, which is other people that can help you in, other people asking for the same information. At the federal level now, they're actually talking about, the idea of frequently requested records. Well, if you want something and you're having trouble getting it, getting two other people to perhaps make the same request can push that out a lot quicker. And finally, and this was something I used to go back and forth on, always appeal. I've finally come down on the side of yes, always appeal, even if it is just a pro forma appeal, one that I hate to say this, it hurts, not hiring a lawyer for. Even if you have to do that, it can create a negotiation process and get you more closely to what you really want and need. And I know a lot of people that do a lot more requesting than I do that are firmly in that camp of always appeal.
And keep in mind that many of you are in states where if you need to take it even further and litigate, you might be in a state where your attorney's fees would get paid, so you probably could find a lawyer who would be willing to do it for you. But also, FOIA lawsuits are just about the most simple lawsuits that you can come up with, and there are some good materials out there on how to do it on your own. I would be remiss in not saying, if you run into a problem, call the Reporters Committee. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, they have, they're up to, I think, like 10 lawyers now. And that's one of the things that they do. And finally, when you're doing a story and you're using records, mention that you're using public records.
Yeah.
Because the public oftentimes has no idea where this information comes from, and they don't understand how important it is. At the state level, you can often, and in cities and school districts, you can often get public information without going through the rigmarole of formally requesting it. On the federal level, you really can't.
Yeah.
They're going to make you really go through all of these formal hoops. So when you get it, tell your audience how you got it. It's really, really important.
That's part of the commit to reform, I think, as well, and write about it and be active. There used to be this feeling that it was inside baseball. Our friend Paul McMasters would always use that phrase. It's inside, papers are reluctant to talk about this because it's inside baseball. But look, if you don't, no one will. Let's move on to access to meetings and places, which is going to be a lot quicker because we know the state of the law is getting, or the state of play here is getting harder and harder. I mean, we are now in a position where not only does the president not engage with the media at all, at least not most of the media, his press secretaries are increasingly, or decreasingly doing so. And when it happens, they are not allowing video or audio or recording. We've got this absurd situation where people are using courtroom sketch artists to draw Sean Spicer. That's where we are now. And that's new, but what's not new is access to the individual employees, the people at various agencies, especially intelligence agencies. It's always kind of been that way. but certainly getting worse. And science agencies, and this again, this is not this administration, it's been building over time. They are, in what we call a coordinated effort to control the message, really making it hard for you to talk to your reporters to talk to anyone. And so the problem is when you're not getting things through FOIA and you want to talk to someone who actually has knowledge, it's being heavily politicized. You can only get to that person if you go through the press office, or if the press office minder is on the call with you, or, forget about getting into the building to do this. That's really difficult. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of law on our side to push back. What do we do? And then I'll come back to you, Lucy. We'll move through this a little more quickly. I mean, one thing that's been tossed out there, boycott government events. Controversial. Will it be useful? We don't know. I'm not advocating this. It's one tool that might have to be used only in the right spot. One thing that is worrisome is the amount of times we see reporters and photographers prevented from attending an event, and then the official handout photo or the official readout is widely publicized, widely published. That's really problematic. That undercuts all the work you're trying to do in one fell swoop, and it's really going to continue to exacerbate the problem, not fix it. I realize there's a need for content, but man, that's always really kind of painful to see happen, especially with photos and videos. What I think has to happen is really the strongest two things you can continue to do are find the right case to make an issue out of. Maybe talk to me about it, because I then talk to other organizations, and then we sort of get a strength in numbers thing going to push back in the right situation. But more importantly, again, going back to what Lucy said about FOIA, explain the importance of this particular issue to the public, why it matters. It's not just a fight between mainstream media and the President of the United States. It's a fight between the public and government officials. That's what has to be conveyed more and more. And I think this is all going to slip away from us, if we don't kind of make that point more and more often, more strongly and more often.
Just to briefly add on to that, this is an example of where technology has kind of gotten out in front of our ability to keep track of it. Politicians and cities and communicators, there are far more students out there studying strategic communication right now than there are studying journalism. And one of the things that they're being taught is how to control the message. Social media allows public officials to go, they think, in their mind, go directly to the public. So why do you need the media? We all instinctively know why, but I think it's in every newsroom's interest to sit down and have a conversation about a uniform thing that everybody's going to say to explain to the public the value of journalism and the value of having reporters having access to this, because we've not done a really good job of explaining to the public why it's important for there to be news media access to public officials and their materials and to events. And oftentimes we're seeing journalists being treated far worse than any other citizen who goes to one of these events. That is a relatively, it wasn't unheard of, but it's a relatively common thing that's happening right now.
Yeah. So somebody asked a question, how do we get a hold of me? I just said you can get a hold of me. Well, you can find me through the ASNE legal hotline page. And I agree that with Lucy back when she said the Reporters Committee are a great resource on FOIA and everything else. We have the legal hotline, and you should feel free to use it and contact me, and I can put you in touch with people. The last call I got through a legal hotline question in an emergency that we can talk about in a few minutes. I actually referred the people to a number of groups, including the Reporters Committee. But you can also reach me at 703-812-0462, or my last name, Goldberg, Goldberg, at fhhlaw.com.
And I can attest to the fact that he will snap to it quickly. He's one of the most responsive people out there.
Thank you. Karen, do you have a question?
Yeah, let me jump in here. We got a number of good questions from editors and others, and I would offer one that seems appropriate at this point. Mark from Oregon, here is what he sent to me. Does anyone have a positive or negative experience of quote unquote shaming government agencies into giving you access to documents or data? Does writing articles about outlandish fees, for instance, prompt agencies or entities to deliver the records, or does it cause them to dig in further? We talk about it in our newsroom often, but we tend to typically talk ourselves out of doing it in favor of the negotiation room. What would your advice be?
I'll defer to Lucy on this first.
Well, thanks, Kevin. A lot of people that I have dealt with would dig in because most access professionals are rather proud of what they do. And most of the time, the reason they're not getting to what you need is because they don't have the time or the resources. It all boils down to that public entity's budget. Most of the time, they take great pride in what they do. And if you just poke them in the eye, they're going to react the same way if you poked me in the eye. That's not to say there are not isolated cases where things have gotten to the point of being ridiculous. And then you absolutely should go public. And I think there have been a number of stories over the years that I've seen where entities, particularly in Florida, have gotten the records and then said, look, let me tell you how many the taxpayer dollars that were wasted because of this. But your instinct is correct. You need to be very, very careful how you manage this. And when you're embarking on a request, it's really a good idea to get to know the custodian, get to know the people who control it, what forces are working on them, and if at all possible, have them help you craft the request. Sometimes that's not possible, but be very, very careful of poking the sleeping bear.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think it's probably situational. I 100% agree with Lucy. You don't want to poke someone just to show them up. They will react very poorly. But if you have the things that seem to resonate are, hey, this is going to look really bad if we write this story and it's clear that you're in the wrong and you've been wasting taxpayer funds, or somebody is going to be harmed that could have been helped, or not being helped that is being harmed. Or better yet, my story is about the public good, and I'm not asking for myself, but you clearly know you can, uncover a problem that will make not the FOIA officer look bad, but the government look bad. Okay, and it's clear they will come off looking bad because the program that the waste, fraud, abuse you're trying to uncover will go, continue. That's when I think the shaming is most obvious, when it's not about the request, but about the issue.
Yeah, I might also add our experience in Tacoma was, I would absolutely agree with you, Lucy, to take good care of your records custodians and to be respectful of them. But I think if your news organization is having a conversation with its viewers or readers as it goes along about how important this is through an editor's column, or as you suggest, adding information and stories about a box of how you got the information for this, that you educate the public about how important this is, you have a little bit more of a leg to stand on in those rare instances where you really do need to just write about it. And that, at least that was our experience.
Yeah.
So should we move on, or we want to take another question? Your call, Karen.
Why don't you go ahead?
Let's move on, because I think one of the next pre-submitted questions we saw kind of relates to this next topic anyway. And the next topic is what to do if you have a reporter that is physically assaulted or arrested. And we have a few examples up here that are ongoing or very recent. These are just like the past few weeks. We have Aaron Cantu from Santa Fe arrested in DC covering the inauguration protest. Dan Heyman trying to ask Kellyanne Conway and Tom Price a question in Charleston, West Virginia when they were there, and he was asking questions about how the healthcare reform would affect that state. John Donnelly, a friend of both Lucy and I, and maybe other people on this call, was, as the quote has gone, manhandled at the Federal Communications Commission. We know about Ben Jacobs and Douglas Doughty, who was a Syracuse.com reporter whose phone was, grabbed, and he was he was handcuffed in the hallway of the courthouse when he started taking pictures and video of a fight that had broken out. So it's kind of a lot going on there. What do we do in response? And I have a slide that kind of answers some of these. I think this is where an editor can really shine. This is where leading America's newsrooms really takes hold. It's kind of a hokey thing, but if you look down the side of this slide, it says prepare. I use the example, you would not send an athlete to, into a game, or an actor into a play, or, a musician on stage without practicing, without going through situations. Baseball players run through every situation possible in practice. 2 outs, man on third. What do we do here? Well, why aren't you doing this with your reporters when you know they're about to go into a hostile situation? You would never send them out there, right? Just cold. And I think there's a lot of things you can do to prep them, which are right here, but they start literally way up front with just sitting down. Among other things, sitting down and managing the expectations of these people you're sending out there. Maybe even scouting the place if you have time. Like, we know there will be a protest in McPherson Square in Washington, D.C. So how familiar are we with this place? What are our points of entry and exit that are going to be safer? Should we send people out in pairs? Do we have just one person there screening? My God, do we have an attorney, an editor, and multiple people on speed dial? All these things that can get you set up so you're not fumbling with your phone at the last minute to get a message out, to get yourself saved. And the most important part, I think, goes back to what Lucy just said and what Karen built on, which was, maybe introduce yourselves to the people you're going to be dealing with. I remember back to hearing Dick Schmidt, who was my predecessor with ASNE, talk about how a lot of the disagreements between the press and the bar, the courts and the lawyers and the prosecutors were resolved when people just finally sat down and talked about it. Be sure that people know who your reporters are. Be sure that, both in the moment and ahead of time, they're identifiable. Going back to a couple of these examples, then I'll turn it over to Lucy and maybe some questions again. A couple things are, Aaron Cantu, as I understand it, was covering this protest, and he was dressed very similarly to a lot of the protesters. It may not be comfortable to go out in D.C. on a 95-degree day in a shirt and tie, but boy, that's going to be it's going to be really helpful to separating a reporter from a protester in the heat of battle. Another thing is wearing credentials. Even if they're not the credentials for the place or event you're covering, it can be really helpful to make sure people know that you're a reporter. Going back to John Donnelly, I think part of the problem was he was at the FCC on a particularly stressful day. And he and I, by the way, are doing here's a shameless self-promotion, doing a webinar just on this topic for the National Press Foundation on June 11th. And he'll talk more about this, and maybe he'll contradict what I'm saying, but John's not an FCC reporter. He's not over there very much. He happened to be there on a very tense day when there was a lot of protest already going on over net neutrality. And he wasn't well known to the FCC officials and security because he's not an FCC reporter. That, I think, it may not have caused all of this. It shouldn't have caused all this, but it certainly didn't help. And I think if he had checked in a little earlier, done one or two things that might have bridged that, it might have kept things a little more diffused.
Over the years, when I was at the Reporters Committee, we knew that every 4 years we would have to set up the Reporters Committee convention hotline. And as the years went on, it got more and more complicated. I think the high point, or maybe it should be called the low point, was in the 2008 convention in St. Paul, where dozens of reporters got caught up in covering protests. Fast forward to when I'm at the University of Maryland, we have a fully functioning bureau that we always have student journalists covering the convention. And this past year, I was just scared to death. What are we going to do with these kids? We knew it was probably going to be very volatile. So building on the Reporters Committee convention guidelines, which, by the way, are still up on their website, very good advice. There are some things that you should do. I made them go through an hour-long workshop that I taught with a couple of my professors. They absolutely should look differently from everybody else. You might even want to consider We got some pennies, some athletic things in case that they could have in reserve, in case our bureau chief thought it sounded like a good idea that their credentials were not enough. Never, ever, ever bend over and pick up a rock or a stick or anything that somebody has thrown through a window. Just separate yourself from those people as much as possible. Have your phone there. I made all of my students write their editor's phone number and the Reporters Committee hotline number on their wrist, so that if they lost their phone, once they got a phone, they could at least call in. They need to have an ID. I like the buddy system in some of these big protests, particularly places like North Dakota with the pipeline protests last year. That's, has the potential we're going to see more things like that. And also, it's very, very important to understand that there is a federal law that applies to state agencies as well. It's called the Privacy Protection Act of 1980. And it says that law enforcement and other government officials may not seize your news gathering materials. And it's the same law that says they cannot search your newsroom unless you are suspected of breaking the law. So if you're just engaging in ordinary news gathering, they can't grab your camera, they can't grab your photo card, they can't take your notebook. Now, sometimes they will, but that if they do, that immediately gives your editor some leverage. We're going, look, don't you guys know about the Privacy Protection Act of 1980? For God's sake, you better go read that law because, we're going to sue you. And by the way, let them go. It's also useful to know in some of these situations in your local jurisdiction, if you're at a protest, what are they going to do with the protesters? Are they going to immediately just issue them a ticket and pay the $50 and let them go? Have your mind made up in these big volatile situations. Are you going to let it go and let your reporter go through the regular process, or is it more important for you to get your reporter back out on the street fast? Because some of these situations, essentially you're bonding them out. So we always tell them to keep $50 in cash in their pocket. But those are mostly in a predictable situation. Some of these things are not very predictable. So the single most important thing to tell them in any situation, if the police tell you to back up and get out of there, back up and get out of there or expect to be arrested. Is it fair? No, it's not. But they're right now not thinking in terms of, oh, is this a reporter? Or to them, every single person at every single protesting has an iPhone. And they don't care if their picture is being taken by somebody with an iPhone or somebody who's a documentarian for an anarchist group or a bona fide journalist. It's not their job at the site to make those judgments. So they're not going to do it. They don't care. So if they tell you to get out of the way or expect to be grabbed.
Okay, let me dive in with a question from Florida, Lucy. Kristen in Florida has a question along these lines. She's working on a checklist for reporters about what to do if they're assaulted or denied access in the field. So tangentially related to what we're talking about. She asks, if a reporter is assaulted either by the person they're covering or another person in the crowd, what steps should they take? And then alongside that, if they are denied access to an event or public rally, is there any immediate resource they can fall on to gain access?
Kevin, do you want to take that? Or
you go ahead. It's up on the screen right now, so go ahead.
You really are kind of stuck if they won't let you in. But if it's something that's coming up, I think somebody back in the newsroom should have the phone number at all times for the chief communications officer of whatever that event is. And if it's possible to do a little advance work, just make sure somebody back there has the ability to call and say, hey, you really don't want to do that. Now, if they are assaulted or grabbed or something, do what the young man from The Guardian did in Montana. He had 2 Fox reporters there. And they were able to get it. Gather up as many witnesses as you possibly can, pull out your iPhone, record a statement from them saying this just happened. Of course, if they're hurt, for heaven's sake, go get medical attention. But if you're in a situation where you have been assaulted, get as many people who were there to document it as possible.
Or at least get their names.
Or get their names.
As witnesses, because suddenly people just go away, right? And they're no longer, you know, you're just not going to find them in the crowd. So you just sort of need to know who they are before it goes away. You saw this. Could you send me your name? Here's my card. You know, it's going to be hard if you're being dragged away. I agree with what Lucy said earlier, that you really have to be smart about how you handle this. Don't fight back. You know, it's never smart. I use the be firm but flexible response. You know, it never hurts to remind even an officer calmly and professionally, look, you know you can't do this. You know I'm allowed to photograph, right? And if they're still being unreasonable, maybe you drop it then. As I do a presentation like this actually for the University of Maryland students, and I often say, you know, I have one slide that just says, never pick a fight with a man holding a gun. Just seems to be, yeah, I shouldn't have to say this, but I do. And so it seems like,
and we're grateful.
Know your limit. Yeah. And so as we leave this, you know, some last thoughts were scope out locations ahead of time and identify exit points, ensure reporters are always wearing credentials, hopefully, and dress professionally. Now we're on to confidential sources. And you know, here we'll just run through really quickly and then go on to maybe some questions as well. The key to remember here is when you have a reporter that decides to make a promise to a confidential source, and we would hope that you have newsroom rules for this that do not, you know, that do not allow that to happen without talking to you first or someone first. Understand that when they make that promise, you don't know where this ends up, because state law may very well protect you, and in 49 of the states plus DC, it almost certainly will to some extent. In some states like Maryland, the protection is very strong, absolute, basically. There are differences, as we see in this next slide, between the states as to how even a state law might apply. And there are going to be different issues, and one typo that I'm going to hope you don't see. But overall, look, in federal court, if something ends up in federal court and you don't know if that's going to happen at the beginning or, you know, of this whole endeavor or not, you could be completely SOL with regard to protection of a shield law. And so you have to really have, again, an early conversation with your reporters as to how far they're willing to go, how far you're willing to go to protect them, and what steps you can do take up front to not get caught. And maybe Lucy can talk a little more about what the government knows about technology, because you did a lot more interaction with DOJ directly than I did, what the government knows about technology and what you can do to sort of play that cat and mouse game successfully. Well,
on the one hand, in the later years of the Obama administration, we actually saw fewer subpoenas because the Justice Department, you know, the FBI, the CIA, all of those folks had figured out ways to use technology to identify who the leakers were. And they, oftentimes what happens in an investigation is they will try to figure out who the universe of leakers is, and then they will go back and see if their suspected leakers had been dealing with the media. So if you're a reporter and they, for example, are thinking Jeffrey Sterling talked to Jim Risen, they're going to go back, they're going to look at Jim Risen's airplane tickets. They're going to look at his credit card receipts. They're going to look at his banking information. All of that is perfectly legal, and they're going to try to identify their suspect without issuing a reporter a subpoena. Now, Risen's subpoena was issued at a different time, before all of these, it was like 2006, if I remember right. And so these surveillance techniques were not as perfected as they are today. Now, all that said, we were really pretty lucky in the second half of the Obama administration in that I think there were some productive dialogues with Attorney General Holder. And there were some guidelines that were issued that said they were not going to go after a reporter just for doing their job, and that they were not going to issue subpoenas as often. They were going to do everything they could. And it was a fairly robust policy. We now have an attorney general who hasn't rescinded that, but Kevin and I both know from having watched hearings when he was in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee, we know how much he loved those shield law proposals. He hated them. And one of the first things he did as Attorney General was issue a subpoena on a reporter. I think he approved one in Oregon.
Yep.
So the other thing we know from our experience in 9/11, the first couple of years after 9/11, when the government shut down access to information, the reporter's privilege frontier was pretty quiet, because it takes a couple of years to get investigations into leaks going. So I am predicting that right now, the Justice Department and Mueller, Robert Mueller, investigating the Russia situation, they're trying to figure out which reporters they want to go after and which journalism entities, it depends on how much they want to know who these leakers are. So if we're going to be faced with lots of federal subpoenas, it's probably going to take another year before the process gets to the point of flooding newsrooms with subpoenas like we did between 2003 and 2006. Remember Scooter Libby and Judy Miller and Matt Cooper and all those fun folks. So we may be just on the cusp of some pretty nasty federal behavior. On the state level, things are relatively stable, but we also know that sometimes state officials are empowered by what they think the feds are getting away with. And that is something I would be vigilant about and, keep an eye on it. But also, it's incumbent upon every newspaper editor out there to know what the law is in your own state. And if you're on the border, know what the law is on both states. Know what your state law is. Know the difference between protecting confidential sources and protecting confidential source information. And have a real, is it protected? If you're in Minnesota, you're never going to be sucked into a civil case. There's a state law banning that. So know what the law is in your state and make sure that your reporters know it too. And then always be aware that when your reporter goes out to cover a story, they have no idea whether they're going to be sucked into the state system or sucked into the federal system. North Dakota, the pipeline again, perfect example of that, because you had federal land, you had tribal land, you had county land, you had all of these law enforcement people from all over the place. And the arrests were being made by all sorts of different people. Sometimes you walk into a situation where things just get all snarled up, and there's not much you can do about that.
Okay, thank you. Lots of good information. We're getting toward the end of our time together.
Oh, can I say one more thing, Karen?
Certainly, go ahead.
Be smart about technology. Be very, very smart about technology. If you have newsroom leaders who know how to encrypt, but even better, don't put something in a memo to your editor. Don't reveal confidential source information in emails. Just know how to protect them, because you will leave an electronic trace. There's nothing wrong with picking up a manila envelope under a park bench.
The good old-fashioned way.
The good old-fashioned way.
Okay. Thank you again to both of you. I think to wrap up, we certainly see each of you as wonderful resources for editors in these situations. I'm going to ask each of you to just give us your, in addition to yourselves, your one or two best resources, places editors can go for more information on this or for support in these kinds of situations. Kevin, do you want to start?
Sure, happy to. Well, again, I would be remiss, even though you've already listed us both as great resources, if I did not remind you that ASNE has a legal hotline. I run this for not only ASNE, but other clients, and I'll tell you the Dan Heyman situation, the first call from his editor, as far as I know, came to me. and his editor had no idea what to do in that situation. And I was sort of like, okay, well, I'm glad you called. Let's figure out what we can do. Even if I'm not representing you, we can brainstorm, because I've seen this, and put her onto both the Reporters Committee and the ACLU and as options, and eventually they got somewhere. I think among resources that I would like people to constantly remember to use when you're in the FOIA arena, I think one are both the state and federal ombudsman. These are not, cure-alls to your FOIA problems, but they are very good at shaking the tree a little bit and getting you some access you otherwise would not have. They are really good at simply getting an agency to respond to you. And not enough people know them, not enough people use them. The same would be true for your state open government coalitions, or in DC, obviously the DC Open Government Coalition, as good resources. Of course, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I'm going to steal Lucy's thunder on this. She'll probably want to use that one. But they're going to be great for answering all of these questions as well. And so those are a couple I would really suggest. And again, look at in the FOIA area the various technology tools I've suggested, because what they're going to do is help you find things without needing to go to an agency for a request. And let me just say in closing, I know we had a couple questions we didn't get to from Pete and Terry. I will call you afterward, full service, legal hotline style, and talk to you about your questions. So if you have any follow-up that we want to discuss.
Thanks, Kevin. Lucy, any thoughts?
Very, very quickly, Kevin listed a whole bunch of organizations that do a terrific job, and I certainly endorse calling Kevin. The Reporters Committee also has a network. Now, your newsroom probably already has a lawyer on standby, but if you're a small organization, the Reporters Committee has a list of pro bono lawyers throughout the country, and they can also help hook you up with someone locally who knows your state law. And the last thing I would say is it would be very much appreciated by the state open government coalitions if more editors and publishers became involved in the states that have groups that belong to the National Freedom of Information Coalition. Those folks are trying to keep an eye on what's going on in the states, in the legislatures, what's happening in the various police agencies around the state. I don't think it's a conflict in any way to be active with those groups. It's in the public's interest to participate. And I would, if you're not already involved in your state NFOIC affiliate, I would recommend that you reach out.
Very good. I know the organization here in Washington State is really strong and really helpful. One other tip I would just offer, and I think now more than ever, as the job of being an editor has gotten more complicated, as these issues have become more complicated, it pays off, it at least did for us, to reach out to your buddy editors, get other news organizations involved in whatever fight you're up against today. The Associated Press has been a wonderful partner in some of those issues as well. So you're not alone. I would offer that. Okay, thank you to both of you, Kevin and Lucy. Kevin, one programming note, you told us that your webinar, the National Press Foundation webinar for protecting reporters, I think you gave us the wrong date. Why don't you tell us?
July 11th, not June 11th. Obviously, I can't travel back in time. I would have done a lot of things differently if I could. And, and I'm doing that with John Donnelly. You can learn more information at nationalpress.org. Full disclosure again, I'm the chairman of the board of that organization until February. And so I'll be working with Sandy Johnson. We're going to be putting together, I think, a really interesting webinar where you're going to hear from someone who's been literally right in the thick of things.
Thanks, Kevin. And in the way of shameless plugs, let me offer one more. While we have you here, I'd like to remind you that it's time to register for the ASNE annual conference. We're doing that in conjunction with APME. The conference will be October 8th to the 11th in Washington, D.C., immediately following the 2017 Online News Association conference in the same venue. So it's a good opportunity to get together with lots of folks. ASNE reminds us, Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Leonard Pitts of the Miami Herald He's not controversial at all. And Campbell Brown, she's not with Facebook. Again, no controversy at all. But they will be delivering our lunch keynotes, and I'm sure they'll be interesting. We ask that you register and make a hotel reservation early to save your spot for the October 10th cocktail reception at the Australian Ambassador's Residence. And here's an added bonus. Those who register for the conference and book a 3-night stay by July 8th will have a chance to win one of 2 $300 Amazon gift cards.
Wow.
For all that and more, please visit asne.org. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.